Summer is the best time for lying out under the stars, gazing into infinity and contemplating the mystery that we exist at all on this our tiny planet, orbiting a star in such a vast ocean of luminous darkness. In many religious traditions, night signifies the cosmic womb of spiritual birth and rebirth, a journey into deep space through the dark night of the soul. And such a journey is begun often by a crisis. Not any old crisis, but a particular kind of crisis, the kind that comes when, as Adrian Rich says, we find we have to pull back from, quote, incantations we've moved to thoughtlessly and disenthrall ourselves, bestow ourselves to silence or a severer listening, find ourselves in free fall. Has it ever happened to you? A time of free fall, when all that you thought held you firmly to earth, all that made you sure of yourself and your approach to life, failed you, and you fell into a space in which you did not know how you were going to go on. The pastoral theologian Rosemary Kenichi calls such an experience a spiritual impasse. Spiritual impasse occurs when something happens in your life for which your beliefs simply are not adequate. Your experience and your beliefs come into conflict, an unresolvable, frozen conflict. Professor Kenichi observes that when spiritual impasse occurs, a person has three choices. One, you can hold firmly to your beliefs and deny what you have experienced. Or two, you can face your experience and abandon your beliefs. Or three, you can become a theologian. Becoming a theologian means you examine your beliefs in light of whether they help or hinder your life and the lives of others. And you take creative responsibility to have your experience inform and transform your beliefs so that they are reworked, reimagined into a new, more life-giving faith. A spiritual impasse happened to me as a young minister. It began with a knock on my office door. Opening it, I met Lucia. She stood there, eyes sad, smile, hopeful, and said, "I saw the sign walking by the church that you are a woman priest. Maybe," I thought, "because you are a woman priest, you could understand my problem and help me." I welcomed her in, and after she settled comfortably, she said, "My problem is my husband. Mostly he's a good man, but sometimes he beats me. One time he broke my arm, and I had to go to the hospital, but I was afraid to tell them how my arm got broken. I went to my priest," she said, 20 years ago, and he told me I should rejoice in my sufferings because they brought me closer to Jesus. And that if I loved my husband, I should bear the beatings, just as Jesus bore the cross out of love for us and in obedience to his Father's will. What I want to know is what the priest told me true? When Lucia asked me this question, I found I couldn't speak. My mouth felt like it was stuffed with cotton. I fell into free fall. I didn't believe Jesus' death on the cross was an atoning sacrifice that saved humanity from hell. But I did believe that Jesus was the exemplar of the highest form of love, self-sacrificing love. And just that past Sunday, I had preached a sermon about how love bears all things. Love forgives unconditionally. Love will never break a relationship, regardless of the pain or cost to you to stay in the relationship. I said love gives no thought to the well-being of oneself, but only to the well-being of the other. I realized in that moment that if I answered Lucia's question the way I knew it must be answered, I would have to rethink my theology, and not only my theology, but the choices I was making in my life based on what I believed about love. Finally, I found my voice and said, what the priest told you is wrong. God does not want you to suffer or be beaten. God wants you to have your life and be free from abuse. Lucia's face broke into a great smile, and she said, I knew I was right, but it helps me to hear you say so. Beginning with that conversation, Lucia made a plan to change her life. She disenthralled herself from the belief she thought she was supposed to follow and forged a new understanding of God's love for her. She went back to school to learn a marketable skill, and when she was able to earn a living sufficient to care for herself and her children, she left her abusive husband. Eventually, her husband got help, and she let him back into her children's lives. The children got their father back, she said, and I got my life back. That encounter for both Lucia and me was the beginning of a spiritual journey, a journey that started with a spiritual impasse and involved a dark night of the soul that led to both letting go and taking hold, letting go of a theology that intensified harm and taking hold of a new understanding of God. As Adrian Rich says, no one who survives to speak new language has avoided this, the cutting away of an old force that held her rooted to an old ground. Vision begins to happen in such a life. The journey for me was a long one. Not unlike Lucia, I had held for a long time to the belief that love bears all things, that love will accept any amount of humiliation, cruelty, or abuse, and never give a thought to the suffering of the self, but only to what is needed by another. In my young life, this belief led me to relinquish a much-wanted pregnancy because my spouse said that was what he needed me to do. If I couldn't do what he needed, he didn't want to stay married. I had an abortion for him, believing it would save our marriage and that it was the loving thing to do. But he left me anyway, and I fell into the rift in the great nebula. I was haunted by the breakdown of all I believed love meant, and by the heartbreak of loss. My grief deepened as days passed, and I spiraled into a profound dark night of the soul. By day, I would dutifully, and to all appearances cheerfully, perform my responsibilities as the minister of a small and vibrant congregation. But at night, I couldn't sleep. I'd rise, pace the empty halls of the oversized old parsonage, and sob. My sorrow and isolation came to a crisis one night. I was past living one day at a time, or even 1 hour at a time, and I was down to the question of whether I could continue to live at all. It was past midnight. I left my house and headed down the hill to the lake. The city was quiet. I was determined to walk into the lake's cold darkness and find there the consolation that I could not find anywhere else. I reached the lakeside park, crossed the wet grass, and climbed the last rise before the final descent to the cold water. As I crested the hill, I was surprised to discover that between me and the lake's edge, there was a line of dark objects stretched the full length of the field. I was going to have to get through this barricade. It was so dark I couldn't tell what I was seeing, but as I edged closer, I discovered it was a line of human beings. They were hunched over some strange-looking, spindly and bulky equipment. Telescopes. It was the Seattle Astronomy Club. There they were with their homemade Radio Shack telescopes, a whole congregation of amateur scientists up and alert in the middle of the night because the stars were out and the planets were near. In order to make my way to end my life, I was going to have to get past a nerd in a baseball cap and tennis shoes who assumed I was there to look at the stars. "Here, let me show you," he said eagerly, and began to explain the star cluster that his telescope was focused on. I did not want to be rude, so I brushed the tears from my eyes and I looked through his telescope. And there it was. I saw it, a red-orange spiral galaxy. And then he focused it on Jupiter, and I peered through to see the giant glowing planet. I could not bring myself to continue on my journey. In a world where people get up in the middle of the night to look at the stars, how could I end my life? In that moment, the words and the music of the song we'd been practicing in church choir came back to me. Sure, on this shining night, with star-made shadows round, I weep for wonder. kindness must watch for me this side the ground. The beauty of the night sky, the dewy grass at my feet, and the Seattle Astronomy Club kept me in this world. It would not be right to say this was a moment in which joy triumphed over despair. I did not defeat the pain of anguish and loss because I saw something more lovely and good. My heart was still breaking with grief, but I became able to feel more. I was able to place that grief within a larger heart, within a wider embrace that could hold both sorrow and joy, loss and discovery, darkness and light, death and life. From that moment, I began a journey to be a more loving person towards myself and all life. In free fall, I found a new ground and made a beginning on new theological language, a transformed spirituality, and a different understanding of love. Love, indeed, is strong, and love, indeed, is strong as death. It can and will bear whatever must be borne of difficulty and grief, of tragedy and trauma and threat. But love also sets limits. It maintains boundaries against destruction. It holds people in safe spaces who otherwise might drown themselves in the depths of despair or self-harm. Love says yes to the sacred worth of every person, but it also says no to behaviors in intimate relationships that are abusive, and not only abusive behaviors in intimate relationships, but in the larger systems of life. Love will not allow Earth's ecosystems, cultures, or peoples to be abused, exploited for greed or gain. Love is compassionate, open, flexible, and merciful, but love is also tough. It can be unyielding when necessary to protect the things that matter most. Love cares for others, but also respects and cares for the self. Love is capable of making great sacrifices for the sake of a beloved or a cause larger than oneself. But love does not make sacrifice an absolute, automatic, sacred requirement in all times and places, especially when sacrifice simply serves to protect the interests and privileges of those who have no transcendent loyalty beyond their needs, their power, themselves alone. Instead, love discerns when sacrifice truly will bring about more life, not just protection of those unwilling to take any risks. Love believes all things. This means that love faces reality, faces what is, and responds to it. It weeps with those who weep and laughs with those who rejoice. Love does not deny or minimize the existence of tragedy or the existence of glory and beauty. Love trusts an ever larger benevolence and opens itself to ever wider vistas. Vistas like we see on a summer night out under the stars, when we can feel the universe as a quilt stitched with tiny lights, wrapping us in a cradle of luminous darkness. And we find that our true home in the great nebula is in the arms of love. If we say God is love, these are the things we mean. Blessings on your journey, friend. If you find you must travel through a dark night of the soul, may your own visions come to you. May you survive to speak new language. And may you discover kindness watches for you this side the ground. Amen. May it be so.